Hey everyone, I'm Mark DeYmaz, founding pastor of the Mosaic Church of Central Arkansas here in Little Rock, Arkansas, co-founder with my good friend Dr. George Yancey of the Mosaics Global Network. And today, functioning in my role for Exponential Next as the Multiethnic Church Next Director, and a podcast with, again, George Yancey and also my good friend Dr. Michael Emerson, some of the leading foremost sociologists in the Multiethnic Church Movement over the past 25 to 30 years, authors, of course, speakers, brought so much research to the table. Again, going back 25 to 30 years. Today, we're going to talk about past, present, future of the movement and get their insights. And by the way, by disclaimer, I should say, I tried to get Corey Edwards today. I tried to get Eunice Hong, even though Nia Kwabi, everybody, all those women were unavailable today because, as we all know, it's important to have multiple voices in a conversation like this. But the way the timing is and deadlines, that's how it is. We'll try to get those ladies on again another time. But anyway, I've already introduced you by name, but Michael, start with you, and then George, introduce yourselves, if you would, for the folks that may not be familiar with you and your work.
Yeah, hello, everybody. So I actually work as a professor and a research fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
Yes, and author of the book Divided by Faith. We're going to talk about that. 25th anniversary, as you know, just came out this past year in November. George, give an introduction on yourself, if you would.
Yeah, so I am at Baylor University. I am a sociology professor there. I've been there for about 5 years. Before that, I was at University of North Texas for about almost 20 years. So
yeah, and of course,
I've been in Texas for quite a while.
Yeah, and that's where I met you, of course, way back in 2003. Yeah. Now, I got to ask you this question. Do you guys fight a lot with Rice and Baylor? I don't know. You're close enough to get in some football arguments or basketball arguments or something like that?
I don't play them that much in anything other than maybe baseball.
Yeah, other than baseball, we're not equals. Baylor is better at everything, but baseball is pretty equal.
Yeah, that's great. Well, for those of you watching and listening today, what we're going to do is kind of overview this movement over the past 25 to 30 years, looking back at where it was when it wasn't anything, how it's developed over time, what's yet lacking as we move towards maturity, and looking a bit into the future. And to start that conversation, Mike, I want to start with you. Way back there, probably mid to late 90s, as I remember your story, you got a heart for some of this understanding about the systemic segregation of the church and where we were. Of course, everyone's familiar with the statement made popular by Dr. Martin Luther King, 11 o'clock on Sunday, the most segregated hour of the week. But nobody had really researched that. It was anecdotal, if you will. We all knew it, felt it, I suppose, anybody who thought about it. But it wasn't until you did some research in the late 1990s that you brought that systemic segregation in terms of qualitative ways, or quantitative ways, I should say, to the forefront. So take us back in your own journey. What got you interested in this? How did that develop? And that led to, of course, the publication of Divided by Faith.
Yeah, if anybody's ever heard me speak before, you may have heard this story, but I was just a young professor, just trying to do my job, and got a hold of me through the movement at that time called Promise Keepers, and just totally transformed my understanding of race in America, and basically said two things. On a personal level, you and your family will live as the racial minority until I tell you otherwise. And what are we at, 30 years now or so? It hasn't told us otherwise yet. And then on the professional level, immediately got me involved in a project. So again, on the personal level, we moved, our kids went to different schools, we switched churches, I got a new job, all to fulfill what God said would happen. He made it happen. And that gave us a context for starting to understand that race really did matter. And so that led and bled into the research that I started to do. And I did a project initially, and then George and I got together for the next project to study multiracial, multi-ethnic churches. And the first book, Divided by Faith, and then the second book, United by Faith, which George was then on, and then some others. But one of the things that we found was, nobody had ever quantified. We all kind of knew we were segregated, but how segregated? So we found that about 6% of congregations in the U.S., and that's across different religions, would be classified as multiracial, multi-ethnic, meaning no one racial group, 80% or more. But when we went and started interviewing these places, we found that it wasn't even that high. And the reason was So many were like just transitioning from one group to another. There was no plan. We asked, how did you become multi-ethnic? They didn't know the leaders. It just happened. And when when you're not intentional about it, it doesn't last. So my best estimate is that maybe 2% of congregations at the turn of this century were healthy, viable, multi-ethnic churches. And now we say, and we'll get into that, I suppose, but something like 20%. So it's probably grown almost tenfold.
Yeah, and you called that in 2019 a statistical miracle. We will talk about that in a moment and going back. But George, talk a little bit about you from where you started in this journey. Obviously, you're African American. That is a very different take in terms of white people that, like me, weren't even paying attention through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. African American, your lived experience probably has something to do with that, but I'm sure it's much more than that in terms of your profession as well. So tell us about you and kind of what got you interested in this way back then.
Well, kind of what's interesting, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, Mark. When I grew up, I experienced racism, but I didn't really worry about racism. I always felt that I could overcome racism, that if people didn't like me, that's all right. I just work hard, I overcome it. And really, for a good chunk, that worked out well. I mean, I got a college degree, first one in my family get a college degree, got into graduate school, all that other stuff. It wasn't until I fell in love for the first time that I found a barrier that I couldn't overcome, because her parents would not meet me because I was black. And that is what really spurred me to really want to study. I realized that my presuppositions about race were in error, that you could overcome it by being a good person. And that really got me into thinking, okay, what is this thing that I experienced? Now, I experienced racism before then, but what is this thing? And that's what got me studying first interracial relationships and then interracial institutions, of which one was the church. And, Mike's was kind of funny how he just emailed me out of the blue. And I was going for some money to study a single church, and he was going for like about 20 times the amount of money to study all over the country. I said, forget my grant. Well, I'll work with you, Mike. So that's how that worked out. So that's sort of how I got into it.
Yeah, and roughly what I guess that was the early 2000s, probably, Michael or George, right? When you were doing that and reached out to George. So
actually, it was right before 2000.
Okay,
because the grant was from 1999 to 2001, if I remember correctly.
Okay,
yeah, that is right.
So right about the time that you published Divided by Faith, along with Christian Smith. So let's go back to that moment, late 90s, 2000. You mentioned some of the statistics and what you found, but at that time, in terms of what now is a legitimate movement in the American church, and I would argue even worldwide in the West and other places as well that I'm aware of. But what was your thought at that time about where things were, why they were like that, and was there any hope? Because when I read Divided by Faith, and you know this, we've talked about it before, and I'm sure you've heard it from others, boy, it was pretty bleak. I mean, those statistics were sobering, and as you all concluded the book, it was like, here's what should happen, but don't expect that to happen anytime soon. And I was literally just coming out of an all-white church of 5,000. I had already had this on my heart in terms of church planting. Then I found that book. It just spurred me on. But at that moment in time, Michael, from your perspective, your research, help us feel the bleakness, if you will, of where things were when the quantitative data came out, and looking ahead of the prospects. Is this going to change anytime soon?
Sure. So it's so interesting because when you look back in the 90s, there was sort of this sense of there really isn't really a racial problem anymore, and we're all good. So, I mean, one of the things we wanted to ask is then why are neighborhoods segregated by race? Why are our churches segregated by race? Why are our schools, and so on and so on? If it doesn't matter, then why does it work out that way? And so when we focused on the church, and you described bleakness, and I felt it. I got literally sick writing it. I mean, physically ill, because as we're exploring the sociological and social psychological barriers to having multi-ethnic churches, they're profoundly strong, right? How do you create boundaries of what a group is and what a group isn't. It's much easier to do homogeneous units, as they say. So, yeah, I mean, there was a sense of bleakness. That's why when that book, even before it came out, that's how I already connected with George. Like, we've got to move to the next step here. There are some multi-ethnic churches out there. How is it so? What can we learn about them? That was the next step, and that led to some other books. But part of that impetus to keep researching was the bleakness of the first book.
Well, I so appreciate your attitude. Even back then, of course, got to know you, that it wasn't enough just to say, here's where we are. But as you guys got into United by Faith, George, of course, was one of the co-authors, talking about an answer to the problem of systemic racism or segregation in the American church. And by the way, if you're watching or listening today to this podcast, I believe, and I think it's widely believed by anybody in our field, if you will, in the multi-ethnic church side, both the sociologists, theologians, practitioners, that divided by faith is really marks the beginning of the true movement, which we believe is a 100-year movement, published in 2000, if I remember, Michael, right? Came out in 2000, right at the turn of the century. And of course, going all the way back to the 1940s and 1960s with Circle Church, for instance, or the 1980s, the man who commissioned me, the late, great, as I should say, Ken Hutcherson, former NFL player, 1980s, and some movement in the 90s. There were obviously, as someone might say, some points of light along the way, but there was nothing aggregated. I look at that as a 40-year flat line until divided by faith. And that's when the line begins to slowly move forward up and to the right. And I've written about that as well. So if you haven't ever read Divided by Faith, that's the starting point, going back to that book. And of course, we'll talk about your 25th anniversary and some of the updated statistics since then. But George, when Michael called you or you got involved at this project, and then you were looking not at just the bleakness, we're using that term today, but at an answer to the problem of race and racism in America, particularly related to the church. What was your involvement in that project? What were you learning as you studied, and what was your hope in the moment as a co-author of United by Faith?
Well, one of the critiques I have with the field of sociology is we're very good at locating problems and documenting them. We're lousy at offering really good solutions. And so my mentality is, how can we solve this? What works? What doesn't work? Very practical, very hard-headed. Whether I like the solution or not, what works? And so that was sort of my mentality going into do this research. I mean, I wanted to document the problem, and of course, you have to document what the problem is. But I was also have the idea of how can we move beyond this, and how can the Christian community transcend the barriers of race in a way that's not happening outside of the Christian community, when we're actually really up until when Mike wrote, we're worse off than the rest of the world. So that's been sort of my mentality. And that's why I one of the reasons why I was really eager to study. And I did write, a book out of that, a Christian book on, here are some principles that are very useful. And I've had people come and say, hey, that book really helped our church to become more racially diverse. So I was really happy about that.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for people, again, watching or listening today to this podcast, hearing from George and Michael, that if you're new to the dance, so to speak, it is so important, in my opinion, to go back and read some of these formative books, Divided by Faith, United by Faith, others by Soong-Chan Rah, our friend Soong-Chan Rah. Even I got in the game in 2007 on the theology and practices, but some of those early books are so formative. They're important to read and to go back and research. In fact, Michael, when you were talking a bit about some of the barriers and what can bring down these barriers, and as you guys moved into United by Faith, 2003, I believe, was when that book came out. I know along the way at one point you said that it's you can say it better than me, but remember how you talked about if you threw 100 seeds out just on demographics in terms of church planting, at least 15 of those churches at a certain period in this time in this period, we're talking about those early years, at least 15 should automatically be multi-ethnic, multiracial churches. But you found, I think it was only like 6 or 7 or some low number. And so talk to us about what that meant at the time and how that kind of continues today. Well, apart from intentionality, we're actually preventing this in some of our actions, our attitudes, and understanding.
Yeah, I'll call it the great American myth, which is that we really are above race. It really doesn't matter that deeply. We all just kind of go about our lives. We're all good with other people and we don't mind diversity and all of that. All we have to do is what you just illustrated, which is, okay, if race doesn't matter, then we can statistically predict based on the percentages of each group and where they live, how many churches should be multiracial, multi-ethnic, how many would not, how many will be white, how many will be African American, so on. Well, we're nothing like that. We are clearly segregated in almost every area of our lives. That cannot happen by chance. It has to happen because of rules, laws, policy, history, culture, and on and on. So that's part of the challenge, right? Is to understand, well, what are all those barriers that we're kind of pretending aren't there, or we're ignoring, or we're trying to counter, but we're facing them and we don't even realize what they are? That's been the great untangling of the last 25 years of this movement, is to solve all of those riddles, those barriers that are almost invisible, but there they are.
Yeah, kind of the intrinsic as well as explicit, or these barriers, that it's intentionality, right? One way or another, you may not understand it, but sometimes attitudes, actions, understanding, life experience, you're actually preventing things from being multi-ethnic as pastors, church planters, whatever. You don't mean to, but it just happens. That's on the implicit side, and others are explicit about it. But the point is, we have to be intentional. And it's very biblical, of course. This isn't about sociology or demographic shifts. Christ called us to be one in the church for the sake of the gospel, Revelation 7:9. That's where we're all headed, on earth as it is in heaven. Christ taught us to pray, right? So this is a very biblical vision. But to your point, it takes intentionality. Pastors and planters must be intentional to overcome those implicit biases that we may be carrying and otherwise unaware of. Well, George, you and I met, of course, in 2003, I believe it was, at a conference billed at the time as the 6th National Multicultural Church Conference. It had nothing to do with that. It was really more, as you observed, a local or regional event in Indianapolis with our good friend, Dr. Charles Ware, and Ken Hutcherson, the church from Seattle at the time. But that's when you and I first had lunch, and we began to talk about the book about to come out, United by Faith. And then we began something there in Dallas, a little gathering of 30 people. I always talk about, that was counting the sound man, the pizza delivery guy, the dog that ran across the parking lot. If you had a heartbeat, you got counted. But that was the first thing we called mosaics. And this isn't really to talk about mosaics and the Mosaics Global Network, but that was our introduction. That led to us getting involved in Dallas, ultimately at that one conference we went to in 2005. If you remember, and I know you guys should, Christianity Today in April of 2005 published an issue centered on Divided by Faith and, of course, United by Faith. And the cover of that issue was all churches should be multiracial. And that's when they had talking about United by Faith, Divided by Faith, a panel. That's where Bill Hybels was on that panel, along with Sung Cha Ra and a few others, saying, I can't believe I missed this for 30 years. And then I think George and or Michael, you steered them to a little blurb about us, our church at the time, just a few years old. But all that's basically history rehashing. George, from the time you and I met and over the next, say up to 2010, even to 2011, 12, even though you all were writing about it, talking about it, I was writing, some others were getting involved. There's church plants, Ephraim Smith and others becoming more intentional. Ray Chang, my good friend, we were doing that. It was still very much off the grid through that first decade, up until really the rise of Black Lives Matter, Trayvon Martin, The Verdict, Michael Brown, Michael Garner. But George, take us back to 2003, 4, 5, and then to 20, to where there's kind of this bubbling, but there's nothing really, it's still very much below the surface, I should say, and where things were in that moment.
Okay, so back then, around the time we were meeting, and I think I had my first book out that was a Christian book, Beyond Black and White, and so I was sort of hawking that book. And so when I went to conferences, and I talked to people and listened to them. Well, I found out because I was generally invited to all white or nearly all white conferences of pretty conservative Christians. I heard a couple of things. First, we're not racist. We don't hate people of color. Second, there's not a problem. And so I realized that one of the deals that was happening, and Mike has enunciated, is this sort of mentality that, there is no problem. And what I used to do to sort of shake them up was to quote some research that I had that showed that their kids more interested in dating someone of the same race than the same faith. Because I want to show them there was a problem. That problem was there. And that usually worked because they had this sort of mentality that there is no problem. And I think that mentality probably carried us, through the 90s, through 2010, this sort of mentality, there's some ups and downs, but ultimately, if everyone just got along, there'd be no problem. 2012, for some reason, I don't know exactly why, 2012 is a pivotal year. There was a lot of attention drawn in the media, in academia, on racial issues, on gender issues, and there's actually research showing that there's this sort of spike in dissertations, spike in the media on this. And I honestly believe that this begins to set up Black Lives Matter. That, obviously you have all this attention paid to all these issues of discrimination. So that happens in 2012. And then comes, I think, was it 20, when was Trayvon Martin? Was that 2014?
Right in there, the verdict
I think
is the
2014,
trial verdict,
something like that.
2012, 11, 13, yes.
So you had all this talk, and then Trayvon Martin happens, and now you have a national event. And then this begins to organize, what we call Black Lives Matter. Now, I still think in the mostly white Christian community, there's still this mentality of we're not racist, and I don't believe that most of them were overtly racist, but there's not a problem. 2020 is when, everything hits the fan with George Floyd. You had Black Lives Matter, which was well-formed, well-organized. You had George Floyd and Arbery. I think it was a 1-2 punch because, the Arbery hit. And everyone almost forgets about him because of George Floyd. But that was a shock, too. In fact, in some ways, the Arbery one, to me, was more of a shock because I couldn't relate to George Floyd. I'm not an inner city guy. I could relate to Arbery because all he was doing was going off for a jog. I go off for
and you
walks
might have
all the
to,
time.
George. I do want to interrupt.
Are you
just
not hearing
real
me?
quick. No, we can, but 1 or 2 sentences on that for people that might not be familiar with the Arbery jogging on the streets, shot by a couple white people down south.
Yeah.
Just 1 or 2 sentences. Give the context of that, if you would.
Sure. So he's basically jogging on the streets. He saw a house being built. He wanted to look over and see what they're doing. A couple of guys, one of which was, I believe, not the sheriff in the law enforcement somehow, came over and basically, tried to arrest him. He resisted because if 2 guys come after me, I don't know if you're kidnapping me. So they shot him. And so that was the shock of Arbery.
And then you had Breonna Taylor in Louisville. It was like a 1-2.
Yeah.
Boom. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so all this brought all of this to the forefront, particularly where white pastors couldn't deny it or ignore it or realize, hey, we're all getting along, because clearly we're not all getting along at that time. And this was that progression that you're talking about.
That was a time when I think a lot of white pastors who had ignored race before said, what is happening here? What am I missing? And that's, and that's a time where you got, the increase of anti-racism, as far as attitudes towards that, and that was, so I think that was a pivotal moment. While as far as multiracial churches, obviously they've been growing since then. And I think that helped some people to at least talk to people that they knew about. But that 2020 year really set a course that I think we're still on today as far as race relations.
Yeah. And I agree. And the reason we're going back and taking that kind of in these segments for people that are just new to the dance, again, we believe it's a 100-year movement. We're at the end of the first quarter. We're entering the second quarter. If you think about like a football game, of course, we talked a lot about that, all of us at the Mosaics Conference, November of 2025. But back in those days, again, the 2011, 12, 13, I want to ask you, a sociologist, don't have to go too off on this, but I think it's a no-brainer, right? Social media and the rise of the iPhone and Facebook around 2007 or 5, 7, 8, surely that must have had something to do with the raising of awareness of these problems of race in America, I would think.
100%, because for the first time, you could, as you know now, anytime something happens, people immediately pull out their phone and they record it and then they post it. So no matter what spin is tried to do by authorities, whoever is trying to tell the story, the video is already out there and you can see for yourself what happened. Of course, it could be open to interpretation, but you see it. That's the difference. We could never do that before.
Yeah. And so that 2011, 12, 13 is sparked a lot by the past 5 to 10 years of social media developing, the iPhone, et cetera, smartphones. All that brought it up. And before we continue down to 2020, which of course, again, was a second big time pivotal time, particularly centered around the folks we're talking about, the tragedies that were involved. I remember, and I'm asking this as a question to see if you verify that, see it the same way I did, but when white pastors particularly could not ignore it anymore in the 2011, 12, 13 time period, it seemed like for the next 5 years, everybody and their mother, every conference in America, two things I should say. One is every conference had a conversation on race. I participated in a couple of those panels at Exponential, Catalyst, and there were many others. I'm sure you all did as well. And they'd get 3 or 4 people on stage. What's the problem? Let's talk about it. What's going on? And so there was this authentic conversation that was started. But after 4 or 5 years, it felt to me like people were tired of talking. A lot of people, particularly people of color, hey, I'm tired of talking about this. Like, we've had enough conversation, right? And if all that leads right up to the era, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, et cetera. But then also not only that, but then you had particularly white pastors, it seems to me. And again, this is a question, who had no theological understanding of a multi-ethnic church, weren't moored in the Bible and the biblical reality of that, and particularly people that might see this as a gimmick or trying to demonstrate themselves in a performative way that, hey, I'm with it. I've got plenty of people of color friends. Our church isn't racist. And it seems to me that was also happening where they jumped in. And that's when they're sending stock photos and postcards and creating websites that show this diversity of people, but they really weren't diverse. It was performative in that sense. And I think during that 5-year period, roughly 2013 to 2018-ish, 19, I think a lot of people of color with good hearts started with appreciation and gave those churches a try, like our good friend Corey Edwards. And she wrote about that, of course, in her book. But then, if you will, turned off because this was more performative. It was surface, and it was assimilation. It wasn't accommodation. So am I right to think about these two things that were happening in that 5 or 6 year period that, in a sense, didn't help the movement, but it kind of brought awareness, but then people started questioning it?
Yeah, and you have movements like Jemar Tisby's Leave Loud movement, where there's this realization that these folks, at least in some of these churches, they're not serious. We're just kind of pawns to make them look good so they can take the good photos. When it comes down to it, if we ask to hear some music other than Hillsong music, they'll just say no, right? So that was a really tough time for the movement. It really was, because for Mark, for the movement, for others leading it, you're kind of back on your heels. Like, you're almost having to defend what was the moral high ground, that, yeah, we're all Christians. We're one family. We ought to be worshiping together. Suddenly that was being questioned. I know people still question it, but we have been able to move forward. And I think, Mark, you diagnose it well, that it became popular. And so lots of folks jumped in on it without serious theological understanding and commitment. Like, this is truly what we must do as a Christian movement, as a Christian community. And it hurt, but you get this kind of weaning out. So, okay, those have kind of fallen by the wayside, and who's left? The ones who are truly serious.
Yeah. And before we go too much further, we've got to talk about our dear friend, Dr. John Perkins, George, or Michael in that matter. Of course, this man, this myth, this legend, our good friend now in his 90s. I mean, way back in the 60s and the 70s, this guy talk about commitment and passion over 65, almost 70 years. Talk about the importance of Dr. John Perkins, both of you, if you will, to the prehistory, to your book, if you will, and then since then, and the legend that he's become for all of us pursuing this vision.
Yeah, I would just say of John Perkins, that to have a man who really walks the walk and talks the talk, lives it out, and not just lives it out by, condemning others, lives it out, living in the area with people, loving on everyone. It's good to have that sort of guiding star. I mean, patriarch, if you will.
Yeah.
And I feel like he's a sort of a patriarch of the movement because, the life he lived, what he suffered from, and yet still kept going on and loving and building a community and doing, we're all sinners. He sins like everyone else, but you couldn't ask for anything more than what he's given to the movement.
I think I thought about Dr. Perkins in this moment, Michael, because you were talking about like it was such a again, the 2013 to 2018, 2019, it set it back on its heels. But a guy like Dr. John Perkins never gave up. And you take heart from someone like that who's walked this 40, 50, 60 years. He just does not quit on a vision for churches for all people, right? And that gave us a lot of hope, I think, then.
Yeah, and I want to give an example. So kind of during the height of that, where people are questioning, should we have multiracial churches, questioning whether we should even use the word reconciliation, right? He and I were on a panel together at Seattle Pacific, and he was getting hit pretty hard. Like, your ideas are kind of outdated. It's all about just justice, as if he doesn't care about justice. But I remember just the strength that I saw in this man who is well into his 80s at that point, that it doesn't matter if reconciliation is popular or not, it is biblical. And I will, until my dying breath, believe in it, and I will never walk away from it. And it was such a witness, just incredible.
Yeah, and that's the biblical mooring that I think in that period of time we're talking about, where a number of white pastors particularly just jumped in, wanting to perform, if you will, wanted to declare themselves not racist, their churches, etc. And again, but didn't really have that conviction, that calling that comes from the study of Scripture, understanding not only all the way back to everyone created in God's image, all the way to the other side, Revelation 7:9. This is where we're going. Whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not, we are all going to end up someday, every believer, in the same body, the same bride of Christ, every nation, tribe, people, and tongue, walking, working, worshiping God together forever in one body. And I think, Michael, going now to the 2020-ish time, and George, you said it's a pivotal moment. Obviously, it was for a variety of reasons. But let's pick it up there, because I kind of feel that it's like this pull of the universe, which of course is God. We're getting pulled to that. Again, whether you understand it, whether you like it, whether you're not, you need to recognize that the Holy Spirit is doing this. And the sooner you get on board the train, the better things are going to be for you, for your ministry, for everything. But let's talk about that then, because it's that pull of the Holy Spirit, the conviction of Scripture, understanding where we're headed in a corporate sanctifying way, or corporate sanctification, I should say. Talk about how we came out of that 2020. Of course, it's COVID. We're not really talking about that. But George, you mentioned it first, and then Michael. Where has things developed since then, and how did it not fall apart, and what were some of the things that steps we were able to take going forward to be where we're at today?
Yeah, so 2020, of course, we had sort of what I call the rise of anti-racism. The most popular books, everyone wanted to do anti-racism, companies, school districts, whatever. 2021, though, was the backlash to anti-racism, or what they call critical race theory. And so you had all these protests against this, and you had all the protests coming back. Now, I do say part of it was the way anti-racism was done was very poorly done. I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, some of the teachings within anti-racism, I'll just say, are unbiblical. But you get this backlash. Part of that backlash is, I believe, is that some whites saw 2020, all the attention given to people of color, and said, well, what about us? And I think that was part of the backlash that happened in 2021. That, I think, sort of set up kind of where we're at today, when we have these interest groups, these identity politics groups that are fighting against each other. And where I want the church to be is not in the lap of either group, but trying to bring people together to find commonalities. Hyatt has a really good distinction between a common enemy approach and a common humanity approach. Common enemy is that we find an enemy, and that's what we have in common as we fight against that person. Common humanity is what do we have in common and how we can bring ourselves together. The opportunity for the church is to figure out this common humanity approach, knowing it's not going to be easy, but I think that's much more biblical than what we've seen in the past. And so, the alternative is to just have what we had before, where we'll have an event and there'll be, people concerned about racism, and they'll generate backlash, and I'm just tired of that. I just want to, can we move forward instead of going through this sort of cycle that we go again and again and again?
Yeah. Michael, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I want the church to be wise to history. So in the United States, let's understand our history. And I'll be very brief and just give 3 moments. Moment 1, Civil War happens, and then Reconstruction. It is the most amazing open time for race relations the country's ever had. We have black senators, black House of Representatives, black governors, and they're being elected. There's all this movement, and what happens? There is a backlash, a white lash often called, that says, wait a minute, that's not the way this country's supposed to work. White folks are supposed to be on top, and that's the way it's going to be. So you can read about that. I won't go into all the history, but we get the Jim Crow segregation laws. We get agreements between the North and the South and the federal government, and just allow it all to stop all that progress. Then we get the Civil Rights Movement. Took another 100 years, right? And lots of progress and policies put into place and new laws. And again, we see a dramatic increase in the size of the middle class for African Americans, Hispanics, and again, a backlash. This one, if you ever heard of the book, The New Jim Crow, profound book, because they find out you can actually study it. Suddenly the shift in our government is talking about getting control on crime and being tough on crime as a way to deal with this race issue. And we start incarcerating people of color at a rate that no country, as far as we know in record history, has ever done. And so once you've got people in prison, and then you basically make them second-class citizens, just like Jim Crow segregation did. Okay, then we have this movement that George just described, this time now. And lots of progress, seemingly, lots of discussion, 2020. And then suddenly you start hearing something nobody knows what it really is, and that is critical race theory. And now it's wokeness. Don't be woke, stay asleep. Let us not change the racial structure. That is the worst thing. It's always the thing we, especially as white folk, as a nation, will not allow. Here's what I want the church to do. Who cares what our society says? What does God say we're supposed to do? Do it. That's what's the beauty of, done right, the multi-ethnic church movement. It's what God wants. It's directly against our country. That's okay.
Yeah, and we have the answer, as we all know. I mean, that's the thing. The Bible, Christ, we have the answer to, if you will, the problem of race in America, but we find ourselves often contributing to that problem and not walking out these biblical principles. I know years ago, I think it was 2016, Michael, at our conference, I shared that year in part about Philippians chapter 2. I think, and I want your response to this, both of you. It seems to me, and this was my observation over 10 years ago, that every demographic group in this country is either fighting to attain power, position, and privilege that it doesn't have, or to maintain the power, position, and privilege that it does have. Whereas Philippians 2, we see the all-powerful one, this one who's seated at the right hand of God. This one, Jesus Christ, namely, of course, Philippians 2, he empties himself of that power, that position, and privilege. He comes down and he leverages that power to give it to us. I thought about, and I shared it then, that, that old game on the schoolyard, King of the Hill, right? Little kids, you scramble up the berm. How do you stay king of the hill? By pushing others down. And I thought that at the time I shared and still believe today, Christ didn't come to be king of the hill. He came to be king of the world. And if you're going to be king of the world, you go down and you push others up that hill. And he gave us, as Ephesians 1 says, all the spiritual blessings, the power, the position, the privilege that we have as children of God. This is because the one with ultimate power, position, privilege, leverage it, came down and gave it to us. But we're, as a country and so many demographic groups, often trying to push the other one down. One of you talked about the enemy, right? And seeing that. So all that's to say, Michael, I know you responded in the moment. I remember that. But to that metaphor, that understanding, and is it true that people are fighting to attain and maintain where we should be like Christ, leveraging, coming down, thinking of others and other people groups more important than ourselves, particularly at this critical time?
I'll give you a story because it is true. For a while, my family and we lived in Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. So I remember going to a bookstore there and picking up a book, and it was a book written in English about if you want to go visit the United States of America, here's what you need to know about Americans. So on the back of the book, it says, the one thing you must know about the United States of America and Americans is everything from their very birth to their death is created and done to figure out who is the winner. That's all that the United States is about. And so that so infiltrates the church that it is the king of the hill struggle, isn't it? Who's got the biggest church? Who's bringing in the most money? Who's got the most social media representation? And stop already. It's just, that is so culturally based. We've got to get ourselves out of that.
Yeah. And I interpret that Philippians 2 as we all do. And even in Ephesians, NT Wright's new book, validating everything we've been saying for 25 years or more, that this isn't just Mark DeYmaz. Don't just think about your interests, Mark DeYmaz, but in the context of that culture, Jewish culture, a collective culture, we could fast forward today, say white people in the church, do not just think about your own interests as a people group, but also the interests of others, African Americans, Asians, and likewise for African Americans. Don't just think about your interests, but of course, everyone in our country is typically thinking about their own interests versus the interest of others, and therein lies much of the problem. So as we move towards wrapping up here in about 10 or 15 minutes, I want to turn our attention to where we are, where we're at now. I have your book, Michael, the 25th anniversary edition of Divided by Faith, just out. Latest research, in spite of the past 25 years, we've made tremendous progress. You've called it a statistical miracle that only the Holy Spirit could be behind. And by the way, since I'm holding up books, here's that one from 2003, United by Faith, that we talked about earlier. So going back and getting some of those books, but this updated version of Divided by Faith is also important to note and read. And so in spite of the bleakness, I suppose, of the difficulty, the challenges we've experienced over 25 years, here we are. The movement is gaining ground in a healthy way. Of course, a lot of maturity ahead. We'll finish by talking about that. But Michael, when you kind of re-examined to write this new book, or the updated, I suppose, what have you found? What are some of the encouraging signs in spite of the challenges we've been through the past 25 years?
Yeah, well, the most encouraging easily is the change in the percentage of multi-ethnic churches. Now the second largest category of churches in the United States, where it used to be the smallest, now only white church. There are more of those still, but the second category is multi-ethnic churches. And
wow,
so
I wasn't aware of that. That's amazing.
Yes, that's exactly the case. It is an amazing statistic. And to do that in 20 years, I do call that a statistical miracle, because as somebody who studies sociological trends, things can't change that fast at that mass level, because you're talking about 350,000 congregations and millions upon millions of people. How can you move them around like a chess game to create that change? You couldn't, because you can't force them to do it. And yet it's happened. Only the Holy Spirit could have done that. Yes, there's growing pains. Yes, lots of mistakes. And we write about that a lot. We are going to be toddlers. We're going to trip. We're going to fall. But just like toddlers, we're going to get back up. We're going to grow. We're going to mature. We're going to become youth. And then we're going to get into our young adulthood. We're going to get there. And I love that you're now saying, 100-year movement, because that is the lifespan. That's like almost, like a typical single person lifespan. That's exactly how long it will take.
Yeah, I think about that as we talked about at the recent Mosaics conference, where entire epochs of church history centuries later are summarized in a single word. In other words, when we think about the 4th century, what's the single greatest event name in this case, or a word that advanced the gospel of the church in the 4th century. We'd say Constantine, his conversion, the dramatic conversion, etc. Reformation for the 16th century. So I've been thinking, as we all know, what are they going to say 300 years if the Lord tarries? They look back on the 21st century. I firmly believe this is the century, I don't know what the word is, but of multi-ethnic integration in the church for the sake of the gospel, because you cannot continue to proclaim a message of God's love for all people, God's love for all people, from segregated pulpits and pews and expect it's going to be believed. And God's not going to let the product, if you will, of the gospel go out of business because us knuckleheads don't get the same room and walk, work, and worship God together as one across the distinctions of this world that otherwise divides. So yes, I do believe that's 100-year movement. 100-year movement. We just entered the second second game, a second quarter, I should say, as we start 2026. And so, George, from where you sit, as you look ahead from where we are now, what is your hope of continued maturity for this movement? We've got the theology down, I suppose. We've written about that. That's kind of well known. Michael, you said at the conference along with Ed Stetzer, we kind of won the argument, right? So we don't have to go beating the dead horse. It's there, the theology, etc., some of the promising practices. But as you look ahead to continued maturity of the movement, I want to ask both of you, starting with you, George, what is some of your hope as we look ahead to the second quarter of the game and advancing the movement's maturity?
Yeah. I think my hope is that, like much of what you said, that we disconnect from the culture that keeps us in these sort of segregated pews, or if not literally segregated by race, segregated by political ideology, segregated by economics, segregated in so many ways. I think, another dynamic that we've seen is a sort of shrinking in the number of people who say they're Christians in our society, secularization, although that has plateaued. What research shows is that, yes, there's fewer, but they're more committed. I want us to be committed to the right things. I fear sometimes we're too committed to political ideology rather than to building the church and serving the community. And I think if we can somehow move away from that, not thinking about what's going to happen next year or 2 years, 3 years from now, but 10 years from now, then I really think we have the chance to have that vision of a truly multi-ethnic, multiracial Christianity. My desire that I hope to see before I die is that when we talk about Christian churches, the assumption is you're talking about a multiracial institution. Rather than what it was when I was a kid, we talk about churches, you assume that it was not multiracial. That it's so ubiquitous that it's unusual, unless you're out in some place where there's no one of that same race, that's unusual for a church not to be fully multiracial. And I think we can get there if we can overcome the temptation to sort of grab at political power and social power and really just do what God calls us to do.
Yeah, we talked about at the last conference, brought forward by our good friends Chuck Mingo and Troy Jackson in Cincinnati, about this second quarter goal for the movement, that by 2050, 11 o'clock on Sunday would be the most healthy, the most undivided, the most integrated hour of the week in all the ways that we would want. To your point, Jet, it just becomes normative, and it's not something we have to be. It just happens. But again, it takes intentionality. And I know back when in 2006 at Exponential, when we first started saying out of Mosaics that by 2020, hopefully 20% of the church will be 20% diverse. That was a big, hairy, audacious goal. And Michael, you've commented on that before. So we have set that, and that is a goal, I'd say, at a macro movement level to see that happen. But it takes intentionality. And I know part of what you've advocated for in the updated version of the Divided by Faith, Michael, and spoke to this at the conference. And I want you to wax eloquent, if you would, for a couple of minutes as you look to the future of getting to a goal like that, where the movement is, where it's been, where it needs to head. I know we need to lean more into justice, not just building a healthy multi-ethnic church, but a healthy multi-ethnic church is engaged in the community, advancing mercy, compassionate work, meeting empathetic needs, advocating justice in tangible ways that transform communities and lives here locally. And we should acknowledge Micah 6:8. but to do justice. This isn't about DEI, woke, but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. So I know that's a big part of your passion and hope for the entire movement as we move forward. Talk about it. Talk to us about some of that that's on your heart and from your hopes for the future.
Yeah, why does God want us to come together across all our differences as a family? It's not for demographic display. It's not like for a fancy show. It literally is because we encounter very different realities out in the secular world, and we are supposed to be supporting each other. You think about your spouse, your children, you'll do anything for them, and you will know them well enough to know what are their struggles, what are their encounters, what do they have difficulties in. That's what God wants for us as a Christian family, across race. We all can bring in different skills, different abilities. We have different networks, and it will work insanely well if we can come together across those differences. Wow, boom. That's what God's calling us to. So there is inequality and injustice, then we're going to address it. We are going to address justice. And as you said so well, Mark, it has nothing to do with being woke or DEI or anything. That stuff, who cares? It has everything to do with what God has called us to do. If you have any doubt on that, do a study on just the word justice in the Bible and see if God cares about it.
Hmm. Yeah, and real quick, just for anybody, again, who's watching or listening and maybe thinking about these things for the first time, very quickly, Michael, would you define what justice means? And by the way, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's in the Bible. But as George said, the world has twisted that or didn't get it right, let's call it. And so that, of course, gives a lot of people a bad taste about this. But heaven is diverse, heaven is equitable, heaven is inclusive. So we've got to recapture that in our churches to demonstrate to the world what this really is. But particularly this word justice, you bring it up on a topic. Just take a moment, if you would, here towards the end of our time, for those listening who may not have thought deeply about it and or who may hear that word and react that somehow justice is antithetical to gospel or spiritual realities. What is the definition? What are you talking about when you use the word justice?
Yeah, now let me make this distinction. There's a difference between secular justice and biblical justice. Secular justice might be described as I don't want equality, I want revenge. And that's just what people get nervous about, right? Biblical justice is about restoring right relationship with God, right relationship with each other, and then right relationship with the created world. That's what biblical justice is. And it's hard to think that that's somehow controversial. It's not. I think the controversy happens when two things happen. One, we incorrectly think it's secular justice, and two, when we are caught up in the king of the hill kind of struggle, thinking, yeah, anything I give up, or anything you gain, I have to give up. It's not a zero-sum game at all. I always like to talk about God's math. 2 + 2 = 4 in the real world, but it doesn't work that way in God's math. Right? You say, oh, okay, I can't give 10% because I've got this bill and this bill and this bill. I always say, go ahead and give 10% and see if you don't still have money at the end. That's God's math. Somehow, it doesn't make sense, but it works. Same here. Justice, biblical justice, you're going to see everybody is more enriched. We're holding each other back when we don't. That's the thing. God wants to just pour it out. All this blessing, and we're saying no because we're nervous, we're scared. I just can't imagine what it's going to be like as we move in this next 25 years towards this more holistic, bountiful understanding of why we come together in multi-ethnic churches.
Yeah, it's so often we're driven by fear, but we're supposed to be people of faith. Or even, George, back to your earlier story about dating a white woman whose parents wouldn't accept you because you're African American. We feel like we're losing something. You know, I came from a single parent home, and my mother, it was very difficult through the many, many years of our marriage until literally my mother's deathbed, when she finally embraced my wife in a very healthy way. But my mother always saw my marriage as her losing a son instead of gaining a daughter. And it was really tragic and very difficult for us all those years. But in the end, she got it right. But why all these years when you're gaining something, not losing something? We're broadening the table. We're experiencing, we're learning, we're giving, we're being a part of God's family. You know, Dr. Perkins, back to him years ago. He taught me, and maybe you've heard him talk about this before, but that old adage, if you give a man a fish, feed him for a day, you teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. But he said, at the end of the day, we go one step beyond that in terms of our understanding of common humanity, representing Christ well, advocating justice and compassion and mercy. He said, ultimately, it's about helping others own the pond. And when you help others own the pond, your pond doesn't shrink. It's like when my fish aren't biting, if I help George own the pond, or Michael, if I help you own the pond, you're going to, hey, come over to my pond because we're fishing. We gain through that when we are helping others own the pond, as Christ gained when he came down and pushed us up that hill. Well, I'm going to give you guys a chance here, one closing minute in just a second. I want you to take a 1 minute, if you will, and talk to the folks listening or watching our podcast today. Your hope, or maybe beyond the hope, what would you suggest or advocate they do to build a healthy multi-ethnic church, to just take a step into the waters, or from where they are to go on? And before you, while you're thinking about that, I should say, when we think about where we've been, and why I'm a big believer in going back and reading some of the early writings of Michael Emerson, George Yancey, Soong Cha Ra, and others in that era of the late 90s into the early 2000s, it's so important because people new to the dance, if you will, you come in right now. And I remember, Michael, I think it was 2019, where you reported that 17% of churches, multiracial, multi-ethnic churches at that time, were led by people of color. And I heard right after that, as you made those statistics known nationally, some people, again, new to the movement, they're like, oh my gosh, this is a white person's movement because only 17% of these multiracial churches are led by people of color. If you don't understand that in 2000, that was 4%, you wouldn't see this progress. You come in at 2016, 2019 at 17%. So again, if you're watching, listening, I really want to encourage you to go back to the history, the theology, the sociology. That's what we tried to map out in this podcast, to understand where we are. It's not fixed. We're moving. It's organic, and we're continuing to press on to the future of God's calling, Revelation 7:9. With all that as a background, fellas, give me 1 minute each. What would you want to encourage a church planter or a pastor, perhaps one transitioning a homogeneous to a multi-ethnic church? What's a word of encouragement as we wrap up today?
I'll give one, and then because George will be more profound than me, so I'll let him have the last word. I think the best thing you can do, and even cause I'm aware that people could be at all different stages, and whether they're church planning or they're trying to change a church to become more multiracial, or they're already on that path. I think the most important thing, one thing I would say is this: go to some churches where you're the racial minority and absorb how you feel, what the differences are. And go to the places that have people that you're trying to welcome into your church. Because it's not enough to say you're welcome. You have to demonstrate you're welcome. And you do that by allowing the culture to be there and to be able to breathe. You can't do that unless you understand where folks are coming from.
Yeah, so good. I think one word about sums that up is proximity, right? And we said in an earlier podcast that I recorded for Exponential that many people believe, I know you both believe that as well, that we can't really build healthy multi-ethnic, multiracial churches unless we first build healthy multi-ethnic, multiracial lives, right? And that's that proximity that you're talking about. George, you get the final word. Give us a word of encouragement. People listening today, how can they lean into this movement?
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's going to be that profound. I'd say, look, we've come a long way. And so, whereas 20 years ago, you had to really look for a multiracial church, now it's kind of easy to find one. We live the sixth American life that Michael talks about in his book. You have a lot of friends of different races. Most people do. Friends. So find someone of a different race who sees things a little bit different from you. Take them out for a Coke or a coffee or lunch, and just listen to them. And this, no matter who you are, no matter what your race is, no matter whether you're the janitor or the pastor or whatever, your class, just listen to how other people see things and appreciate it. You don't have to agree. Just listen so you can understand where people are coming from. Because next time there's a racial incident, you'll know why that person thinks the way that they do, and you'll be able to talk to them in a way that matters, in a way where you might convince them to see something different.
Yeah, to
We're at a
listen.
stage now where just listening is what we need, and
Yeah, and
that's
to
what I
listen,
encourage.
I was going to say it recalls James, right? In the book of James, where you need to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. America's got us totally reversed. We're quick to attack and not listen and be angry. And again, both individually and collectively as churches, we need to reflect the very best of heaven, the very best of Christ by willing ourselves to walk, work, worship God together as one, drawing near in humility to learn, to listen, and then, of course, ultimately to represent Christ well in our churches. Michael, George, I really appreciate our friendship all these years. But on behalf of everyone that's involved in this movement, you guys are pioneer trailblazers, forerunners, your writing, your heart, your passion, the sociology that practitioners and theologians like myself benefit from, have needed, and were able then to, with that, begin to press into the theology, the best practices, all that. Couldn't do it without you guys. You've been amazing. Again, Corey Edwards, Onia Kwabi, Eunice Hong, others, ladies in the movement, other sociologists, thank you so much for your passion, your tireless work. All these years, still in the game, still fighting out, still championing a vision for churches to reflect the best of God's love for all people, not just some, on earth as it is in heaven. And thanks for listening today, watching, wherever you are on the podcast. On behalf of Exponential Next, I'm Mark DeYmaz. Again, encouraging you to get involved with Exponential. We've got global conferencing every year, regional conferences, even worldwide conferences that take place in Europe. And Exponential is a place for wonderful resourcing for church planting, growth, and multiplication. So I hope you'll take advantage of some of those in-person resources and connections, as well as many other resources online through Exponential. God bless all of you again. Mike and George, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you.